Welcome to Westford Climate Action's Neighbor to Neighbor EV 101 event. Westford Climate Action is a grassroots organization of town residents who are concerned about the climate crisis and advocate for mitigating actions that can be accomplished locally. Our co-sponsor tonight is Westford's Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee. Their mission is to guide the town of Westford to a future where by 2050, net emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases attributable to all sources in town are zero. My name's Jerry DeBello, and I'm a member of both groups. This is the first of a two-part event. The second part is going to take place on Saturday, or this Saturday, from 9 a.m. to noon in the parking lot that's next to this Millennium School building. We'll have both pure EVs and hybrid vehicles from multiple manufacturers on display, and you'll be able to talk to their owners about their experiences of owning or leasing their vehicles. If anyone in the room or the online event have an EV or plug-in hybrid, we invite you to volunteer to bring your vehicle to our Saturday event. Tonight, we welcome Anna Vanderspeck, Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumer Alliance, and she's here to deliver a wide-ranging presentation regarding all aspects of EV ownership and leasing. At the end of the presentation, Anna, myself, and Tom Teller, the organizer of Saturday's event, will answer questions from those of you online and in the room. For those online, we ask you to ask your questions at any time using the Zoom chat function, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. Anna, the floor is yours.
Well, hi everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to come out and talk about EVs. So I have a presentation that can take anywhere to 30 to 40 minutes depending on how rambly I get, but I really welcome any and all questions. I guess, do I just say next slide to folks at the computer? Sure. Thank you. You can take your time. So I work for an organization called Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're a nonprofit organization, and we do work across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Our mission is all about empowering consumers and communities to get to a zero carbon future in a way that is just and makes sense. And so we run a series of programs and services that touch on clean heating or solar or wind or lots of different topics. And we also do advocacy work at the state level. But I'm here today to talk about electric vehicles specifically. If we go to the next slide. Oh yeah, that's me. My name's Anna. I'm the Electric Vehicle Program Director, but for this presentation, it'll be broken into a couple pieces. So at the first part, we'll talk about why electric cars make sense, both from a sort of societal standpoint and for you, the driver. Then we'll talk about some things that you need to know, like how charging works and range and all the incentives. And then at the end, we can answer lots of questions. So we'll jump right in with the why to the next slide. So there are lots of benefits that we'll talk through in a little bit more detail, but at a high level, EVs are better for the environment. They reduce greenhouse gas emissions pretty substantially. They are recyclable in a way that gas cars will never be. And they also reduce emissions of the types of pollutants that really harm human health. So particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, all the stuff that is causing asthma and emphysema and all these public health issues that we have. EVs don't have because they're not combusting fuel, at least battery electric vehicles ones. They're also much more efficient, which actually explains why the emissions are so much less per mile driven, and also explains why they are cheaper to charge. And those benefits are for you, the driver. We've also got lower maintenance costs, and they're fun and fast, but we'll dive into all of this in a little bit more detail. So first, often when I talk about electric cars, people say there's so much coal in the grid, like aren't they just as dirty as gas-powered cars? And the answer in New England and most of the country, but particularly New England, is no. So this is data from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a cool EV tool where you can plug in your zip code and you can learn about the comparative emissions of a gas car and an electric vehicle charging on the grid in your area. So the average gas-powered car emits around 381 or up to like 400 is the average range that I've seen, grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile driven. And you can see that a plug-in hybrid, which is a vehicle that has a battery that you can charge up by plugging the vehicle into an outlet, but also has a backup gas tank, that has about half the emissions per mile driven. And so the assumption we're making here is based on the mix of generating sources that are on the grid in New England. So just by switching from a gas car to a plug-in hybrid, you can cut your emissions in half. And then if you go all the way down to a battery electric vehicle, you get to 96 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile. That's about a quarter of that of a gas car. And that number is going down over time as we add more and more renewables to the grid. So quick answer, if somebody goes, isn't there so much coal that they're the same, is no. It's a lot cleaner to switch to an electric car. If we go to the next slide, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts. We've actually done a relatively good job over the past 20 years of cleaning up the electric grid itself. And that's definitely a work in progress, but transportation and building emissions have not budged. The fleet overall has gotten more efficient, but at the same time, we're all driving more miles than we used to, and vehicles are much bigger than they used to be. So transportation emissions have not really moved. And if we want to meet our climate goals, which are reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030, and reaching net zero by 2050, there's no way we can do that without reducing transportation emissions significantly and quickly. At this point, people often say, but what about manufacturing the battery? Isn't that super carbon intensive? And this is another resource from the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows you the life cycle emissions. So taking manufacturing into account over the life of the vehicle, what are the comparative emissions of an electric car versus a gas-powered car? And for those of you who are kind of far away from the screen, I'm not sure if you can see it, but the orange bar for each of these is the carbon emissions associated with manufacturing the vehicle. And then the blue is the carbon emissions associated with manufacturing the battery. So you can see that when you put the blue on top of the orange, the manufacturing emissions of an electric car or an electric truck are higher than that of a gas car or a gas truck. But if you add the vehicle operation, all the gas that those vehicles are burning, you can see that the overall emissions over the life of the vehicle are much smaller, both for electric cars and electric trucks. So this resource was showing you nationwide data, and the New England power grid is cleaner than the nationwide grid on average, so those emissions reductions are even bigger in New England. Public health is something that I think people are talking about more and more, thanks to COVID and our better understanding of how important lungs and air quality is. But gas-powered cars are really a public health menace. I think I at least grew up with the idea of we're not where we were in the 70s when you could taste the smog, so it must be so clean now. But it really isn't. And the American Lung Association has done a lot of research showing just how much we're paying in terms of our health and healthcare costs because of our reliance on burning gasoline and diesel for transportation. So we always want to highlight that electric cars, if you're driving a battery electric vehicle, it doesn't have any tailpipe emissions. There's still some particulate matter from the tires, but way less because there's no tailpipe emissions. And then again, if you take into account even how we're burning the electricity, they're still cleaner, both in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and these sort of local air pollutants. And we always want to highlight that climate change is itself a public health threat. So switching to EVs makes sense for public health impact, both directly and indirectly. One of the underlying reasons for all those benefits I just talked about is efficiency. So an average gas-powered car, when you fuel it up with a gallon of gasoline, about 80% of the energy in that gallon of gasoline is actually lost, mostly due to friction and the creation of heat, and doesn't actually go towards moving your vehicle forward. And I find that statistic staggering because we've been working on the internal combustion engine for 100 years, and we're at 20% efficiency roughly. Electric vehicles are closer to 60 or 70% efficient, so less of the energy that you're putting into the fuel tank, so to speak, is getting lost. An easy way to see that or to think about that is by comparing the miles per gallon of gas cars and the miles per gallon of electric vehicles. So that MPGe concept is how far does that vehicle go on the amount of energy that is stored in 1 gallon of gasoline. So it's 33.7 kilowatt hours worth of energy are in 1 gallon of gas. And so when you put the miles per gallon and the miles per gallon electric on a graph like this, you can compare gas and electric cars on an apples to apples basis. So on the right in orange, you will see a couple of popular or well-known gas-powered cars. So you can see the Ford F-150 gets the sad 23 miles per gallon. Toyota Corolla gets 35 miles per gallon. And then on the way left, you can see some of the, excuse me, that probably picked up on the mic. You can see the miles per gallon electric of some popular electric vehicles. So the Tesla Model 3 drives at the equivalent of 132 miles per gallon, which is just wild, and we're never going to be able to get an internal combustion engine to that level of efficiency. So when you're looking at different vehicle models, you can look at the miles per gallon electric to get a sense of how efficient is that vehicle. At this point, we talk about fuel costs because people are like, great, they're so much more efficient, but how much am I actually going to have to pay? So the short answer is it's cheaper to drive a mile on electricity than it is to drive a mile on gasoline because of those efficiency benefits. And that's true even in New England, where we have relatively high electricity prices compared to the rest of the country. This is a really busy table, but it is unfortunately the best way that we can think of to explain, based on your actual electric utility, what do your costs look like. So you all, I think, are National Grid territory.
Yes.
So you're paying 34 cents a kilowatt hour unless you're signed up with a competitive supplier or some aggregation program. But the basic supply rate for National Grid is 34 cents a kilowatt hour. And it will be that way until July of 2024, when the National Grid will go back to the Department of Public Utilities and ask, or basically set a rate for the next 6 months. And if you assume an efficiency of an average electric vehicle, I think we took the Chevy Bolt as an example here, that translates to about 10 cents a mile on electricity. And the last time we did this math, which we probably should have updated for this presentation, sorry about that, if you take some similar assumptions about a gas car, you're paying about 12 cents a mile on gas. So right now, at that point, the savings were about 2 cents. I will say that those electricity rates are higher than normal and those gas rates were lower or okay. And so at different times, you'll see those savings really increase, particularly in the summer. But the other thing to point out is that electricity costs, with the exception of this last winter because Putin invaded Ukraine, electricity prices have generally been much more stable than gas prices over time. So you can predict what your fuel costs are going to be much easier in an electric car than a gas-powered car. And when we share these slides after the presentation, you can click on one of these links to see how we did our math, and you can plug in your own numbers if you are with an electricity supplier that has a different rate or something like that. The other piece to benefits to you, the consumer, are that the maintenance costs for these electric vehicles are so much lower than for gas-powered cars. If you look at the sort of scheduled maintenance for a new electric vehicle, it's basically rotate the tires and check that the computer's working, and that's it. There aren't any oil changes. The cabin air filter. Yeah. So I encourage you all to ask the EV owners who are here what maintenance they've had to do over the past couple of years, but Consumer Reports did a study a couple years ago where they looked at several thousand actual electric vehicle drivers and looked at their actual costs and found that over the life of the car, the maintenance costs are about half. So that is really good. We often get questions about what about the battery, like what if I need to replace the battery? The batteries are all warranted for at least 8 years or 100,000 miles. And if there's a manufacturing defect that's going to impact the battery, it's going to happen in those 8 years, and the replacement will be fully covered by that warranty. And people have been concerned about battery degradation over time. Batteries do get a little bit weaker over time, but it's been at a rate of about 1% a year. And so you might see a range decrease by about 1% a year. And if you're getting a vehicle with 300 miles of range, that's not very much. So the batteries should last as long as the vehicle itself does. The last point here is on regenerative braking. This is a technology that protects the brakes and also makes for much smoother driving experience. So if you're in an electric car and you have the regenerative braking setting on, if you take your foot off of the accelerator, the car will recognize that you want to slow down, and it'll slow you down basically by spinning magnets around the wheels and taking that energy and putting it back into the battery, which means you don't have to move your foot from the accelerator to the brake as often, which seems like it's not that hard until you get used to not doing it, and then you have to go back to doing it when you're driving a gas car and you realize how unpleasant that is. But it also means that A, your range is extended, and B, your friction brakes don't get used as often, so the brake pads last longer. So that's just one of many examples about why the maintenance costs are so much lower. If you want to nerd out, this is a fun graph from the Department of Energy that shows you scheduled maintenance costs for light-duty vehicles. That's what the LDV is for different vehicle types. So the column on the left is ICE vehicles, that's internal combustion engine vehicles, so gas cars. The next column over is hybrid electric vehicles, so those are traditional hybrids that don't plug in. Then you've got PHEV, plug-in hybrid vehicles, and BEV, battery electric vehicles. And basically you can see that as you move over towards electrification, the scheduled maintenance costs go way down. And if you're at a battery electric vehicle, there are entire categories of scheduled maintenance costs that just don't exist. So transmission service, spark plugs, oxygen sensors, timing belts, none of that exists on a battery electric vehicle. Neither does the fuel filter or the engine air filter or the oil filter. It's only the cabin air filter, as you said, that's there. And so here it's not quite the 50% that the Consumer Report said, but it's 60%, so a 40% reduction in just the scheduled maintenance costs. And then you also, there's just fewer moving parts that are going to break and need replacement. So two different ways of looking at the same issue, but I encourage you to talk to the EV owners here today or on Saturday to see what their experience has been. And last but not least, they're fun to drive. This is not something that is super important to me or wasn't super important to me. I came at this from a climate perspective, but once you get in one of these vehicles and get used to driving it, you will notice, and then you will be sad when you have to go back to a gas car. So these vehicles accelerate much faster than gas-powered cars. They're much quieter. Because they're new, they have all sorts of fancy safety settings, and people just really, really love them. And so if you can come to the event on Saturday to meet real people, they'll tell you how much they love their cars, but overwhelmingly people really enjoy the experience of driving an EV. So we know that there are lots of questions about how do I get anywhere in an EV, how do I charge? So that's what this section is about. The first thing to highlight is often when people think of electric cars, the image that comes to mind is the sort of weird bug-eyed Nissan Leaf of 8 years ago that got 80 miles per charge, and people think, oh, that's not enough for me, I'm never going to get anywhere. But the models that are out now have much more range than they did even just a couple years ago. So at this point, the average new car will have well over 200, if not 300 miles per charge. And that is way more than most people drive in a day. The average in Massachusetts is somewhere around 20 to 40 miles per day. If you've got an electric car that gets 200 or 300 miles per charge and you are able to charge at home, which is a blessing if you can do that, it's very easy to go electric because you're never going to run out of range on your sort of daily basis. And we'll talk about charging on the go in a minute. There are still some plug-in hybrids available where you can do most of your daily driving on the electricity, but then have that backup gas tank if you do want to go on a really long trip or need to get somewhere very fast where there isn't charging along the way yet. So the range is really a lot more than people think and works for a lot of people. Charging itself comes in a couple different flavors. So on the left on this slide, you'll see first, a port. This is the J1772 port, which up until now has been the standard for level 1 and level 2 charging. I'll talk about why that's changing in a minute, but a lot of the vehicles that you'll see on Saturday, for example, have that J1772 port. And if they don't, they're a Tesla and they have a Tesla port. But basically, this allows two types of charging. Level 1 is when you take the vehicle and you plug it into the same outlet you would plug your cell phone into, and that gets you about 4 miles of range per hour spent charging. It's called a trickle charge because it's definitely the slowest type of charging. But if you drive like 40 miles a day and you can plug in overnight for 10 hours, you can get those 40 miles without having to do any installation of a charging station in your home. So don't discount it. And we have a guide to help you figure out if it would work for you or not. The next level up is called level 2 charging. That's at 220 volts. It adds somewhere between 11 and 50 miles of range per hour spent charging, and it depends on the vehicle and the charger a little bit. But this is the type of charger that you can install in your home, either inside or outside. And it's also what you see in a lot of public settings. So right outside this building, there's a public level 2 charging station. So if you've seen bright orange charge point charging stations in any parking lots, those are likely level 2. The fastest type of charging is called DC fast charging. The DC stands for direct current. And this is the type of charging that you would do if you're on a road trip and you need to stop somewhere for just a couple minutes and fill up a lot. The speed of DC fast charging really depends on how powerful the charger is and how much power your vehicle can take. So some vehicles charge at 50 kilowatts, others charge at 350 kilowatts, but roughly you can do around 80% of the battery in half an hour. For the Chevy Bolt, which is sort of our standard case here, it's around 90 miles in 30 minutes. For some of the fancy Teslas, it's like 120, 150 in 30 minutes. So it does depend on the vehicle, but we've got information on our website for you to figure out which vehicles charge faster and which ones charge slower. The two images you see on the right are the two charging ports that up until now have been kind of the standard. So the J1772 combo is the same thing as the J1772, just with these two prongs underneath. And that has been the standard for American and European manufacturers. And then CHAdeMO on the right, which is a totally different shape, has been the standard for Asian manufacturers. So if you've got a Nissan Leaf, you have a CHAdeMO plug. This is all changing, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So Tesla, from the get-go, has had its own charging hardware and software that is now called the North American Charging Standard, or NACS. So if you know anybody who drives a Tesla, they've got a totally different port on their vehicle. And Tesla has invested really, really heavily in building out charging infrastructure across the country that for years has meant that you can drive a Tesla from California to Massachusetts and there's charging all along the way. So this map is a map of all the Tesla charging stations. One benefit of the NACS, or the Tesla charger, is that it's the same plug for all three types of charging. So you don't have a J1772 and then the combo, or the J1772 and then CHAdeMO. It's just one plug for all three types. And they've got over 20,000 superchargers, which are their highest power chargers across the country. If we go to the next slide, the good news is that Tesla has partnered, or basically made its technology open to partner with all these major auto manufacturers. So at this point, there's basically no manufacturer that is building an EV that hasn't partnered with Tesla. And what all of these partnerships mean is that this year, if you drive a vehicle from one of these manufacturers, you can get an adapter that will allow you to use a Tesla charging station. The different manufacturers are going about this in different ways. So some of them are just sending them to everybody. Some of them are making you register for it. Some of them might make you pay for it, but the technology will be there that you can get one of these adapters, and that'll allow you to use a Tesla charging station. And then starting in 2025, the new vehicle models that those manufacturers put out will just have the North American Charging Standard port in it. This is good news in the long term. In the short term, it's a little confusing for people, but in the long term, it means that you won't have to worry anymore about, can I use this port with this vehicle when you're trying to find public charging? It'll all just be one type. And in opening this up, Tesla has relinquished some level of control. They can't just dictate that suddenly everybody has to do X, Y, Z, because that's now a more open standard. But it means that there's just going to be more charging available for non-Tesla drivers, and Tesla drivers have had a grand old time having lots of charging, so they'll be fine. It's my unofficial opinion. So how do you find charging on the go? There are lots of different charging network operators out there that are building out infrastructure that you can use as an EV driver. And you can go to each one of their individual apps or websites to see their map. But what we like to do is point people to a resource called PlugShare. which is a website and also an app that is crowdsourced. So anybody can say, oh, I found there's a new charging station in my neighborhood. I'll put it on here so that people know about it. But what is nice about it is that you can put in a location and see all the charging stations that are nearby, and then you can sort or filter if you only want to see Tesla stations or only want to see EVgo stations. You can do that, but you can see what's generally available first. So on these maps, anything that is green is a level 2 charging station, and anything that is orange is one of those high-powered DC fast charging stations. And it's a little bit messy because their map is a type where if you zoom in, like more of these things pop up. But you can see when you're on the app, and we can pull it up if people are interested at the end, you can click on one of these things and it'll tell you exactly where that charging station is, where in the parking lot it is, which is surprisingly helpful if you're like rolling up to a Walmart and you're like, which corner of this parking lot should I go to? It'll tell you what it costs, and then sometimes other EV owners will check in and be like, it worked, I charged for 3 hours and it was fine, or it'll tell you what amenities are nearby. So if you're trying to plan a trip, it's a good place to sort of start and see. So there's a lot more charging than people think. This is a sort of very high level snapshot of the state. On the next slide, I think we show Rhode Island and the Cape. The Cape for a long time did not have a lot of charging, but they are really building that out, which is exciting to see. But again, if you zoom in on this map, you'll see more and more. There's other tools like this, but this is a good starting place. If we go to the next slide, if you are lucky enough to own where you live and be able to install a charging station, we have a guide that will help you walk through how to figure out if that is possible for you, what questions to ask an electrician. And it's also helpful. It's helpful if you have an EV and you're like, I definitely want to install a charging station, but I don't know where to start. But it's also helpful if you're like, could I even do this? Like, should I consider an EV? Can I charge at home? It'll help you sort of figure out, okay, if you're thinking about this kind of vehicle, do this. If you've got that kind of vehicle, do that. So that is a useful resource, I hope, for you to use. And then we've got a parallel one for apartments and condos, which is the next slide, which we are updating right now. So what you'll find right now is a little out of date, but we're updating it right now because there are lots of new incentives from the electric utilities to install charging, not just at single family homes, but also 2 to 4 family homes and homes that have more than 5 units. So there's lots of cool new incentives to know about, and we're updating all that. Speaking of incentives, we can now go through the fun rodeo of all the incentives and how complicated they are. So buckle up. The good news is there's a lot of money. The bad news is it's very complicated. So we'll get into it now. So we've had a federal tax credit for electric vehicles since the Obama years, really, but the Inflation Reduction Act that was signed into law at the end of August of 2022 really changes the structure of the tax credit. So high level, it's up to $7,500 on eligible models that meet battery and assembly requirements that we'll go through. It's valid through 2032. For battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and also fuel cell electric vehicles. I don't spend a lot of time talking about fuel cell electric vehicles because there aren't very many out there, and there's all of one refueling station in all of New England. So if you would like to do that, you can, and there's a federal tax credit, but we're going to focus on battery electric and plug-in hybrids. The really cool new thing about the Clean Vehicle Credit is that you can claim it at the point of sale if you're at a participating dealership. So this opens up this credit for a lot more people who couldn't necessarily shell out $7,500 and then wait up to a year to get that money back, but can just get it right off the top at the dealership. You do have to purchase from an IRS registered dealership, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there are, for the first time, income requirements. So to qualify for the Clean Vehicle Credit for new cars, your income has to be under those limits. I mentioned that there are complicated battery and assembly requirements. These are the sort of 3 sets of requirements that a vehicle needs to meet. Before I go into them, I will say you do not need to memorize this. There is just a list out there that you can look at that will tell you how much a vehicle qualifies for. But if you're interested, these are the 3 requirements. So first, the vehicle has to be assembled in North America, and you can check that with the vehicle identification number. Secondly, the vehicle has to be under an MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price has to be under a certain cap. So for SUVs, vans, and pickup trucks, that's $80,000. For sedans and hatchbacks, it's $55,000. I want to highlight that this is an MSRP cap, so if you are looking at a vehicle that costs $54,000, but because you got the blue one, or with taxes or registration fees, it's over that limit, it's the MSRP price cap that counts, not the final sales price. And then there are two sets of mineral and battery component requirements that are really, really complicated, but are effectively trying to make sure that an increasing percentage of both the batteries components and the minerals are either recycled or from North America or from countries that we have a free trade agreement with. They're very complicated, but they are the primary limiting factor, I would say right now, as to which vehicles qualify. So if a vehicle has to meet 1 and 2 to qualify, and then 3 will tell you how much it qualifies for. So if it doesn't meet either mineral or battery requirements, the federal tax credit is 0. If it meets one but not the other, it's $3,750, and if it meets both, then it's $7,500. Again, you don't need to memorize this, but this is explaining why some vehicles have the federal tax credit and others don't. One great thing from the IRA is that for the first time we've got a clean vehicle credit for used vehicles. It's a little bit simpler because the battery requirements don't apply. The amount is $4,000 or 30% of the sales price, whichever is lower. Again, you have to buy the vehicle from an IRS registered dealership. The vehicle must be at least 2 years old and cost less than $25,000. And it only applies at the first resale after August 16th of 2022. So if you are the third owner of this vehicle, it doesn't matter if the second owner got the used car tax credit or not, you don't qualify. And this is why you have to buy from an IRS registered dealer, because they have access to a portal where they can tell you this vehicle qualifies or it doesn't. And then there's still an income threshold, and it's basically half of what it was for the new vehicles. So your income has to be under that limit to qualify for the federal tax credit. So how to claim the federal tax credit. You can either choose to transfer the tax credit to the dealership at the point of sale and get that cost right off the top, or if for some reason you really enjoy filing your taxes, you can choose to take the credit when you're filing your taxes. If you choose to transfer the tax credit to the dealership, the language on the IRS website is that you can choose to receive cash, apply it towards the down payment, or apply the credit towards the cost of an EV. The one thing to really point out is that if you do get the tax credit at the point of sale, your personal tax liability no longer matters. So if you take the tax credit when you file your taxes and you don't owe $7,500 in federal taxes, you won't be able to take advantage of the full federal tax credit. But if you transfer it to the dealership, you can. So this opens this up to people who might not have the tax liability to get the full value otherwise. So that's a really good thing about the IRA. And then, yeah, that's basically the last point that I made. So the next slide, I think, is a checklist of like how to actually do this. So if you want to get an EV, if it's new or used, these are sort of the steps that we recommend. So first, check that your income is under the required limit. If it's above, congratulations. That is great for you, but you unfortunately don't get a tax credit. Second, make sure that the dealership you are working with has registered for the IRS Clean Energy Online portal. There is not a list. The IRS has said that I don't understand what reason, they cannot disclose a list of dealers that have registered, which is really, really frustrating because it means that if you're at a dealership, you need to ask them. And unfortunately, because this is still new, you need to ask several people. Make sure you find a general manager and that they confirm that they are registered, because sometimes the salespeople don't know or are confused. So it is important to ask that question. But it's kind of easy to figure out if they are when you get to step 4, because you want to, regardless of when you file the tax credit or when you claim the tax credit, make sure that when you get that car, you are getting a copy of the time of sale report that the dealer has to submit to the federal government through that IRS Clean Energy portal, and a copy of the confirmation from the IRS that they actually received that point of sale or time of sale report. So this is confusing and complicated because this didn't used to be a thing. You didn't used to have to get any special paperwork from the dealer. Now you do. And when it comes time to tax season, you have to file this Form 8936, regardless of if you got the tax credit at the point of sale or not, and regardless of if you normally file your federal income taxes. So that is some extra paperwork that is unfortunate, but I hope this checklist helps. There is an important leasing loophole. So the Inflation Reduction Act didn't just create a tax credit for passenger vehicles, it also created one for commercial vehicles. And that one does not have all the same crazy requirements that the federal tax credit for individuals does. So if you lease a vehicle, the dealership or the leasing agent really can claim that commercial tax credit, and many are passing the value of that on in the form of lower monthly payments or just lower lease prices. So you're seeing some manufacturers advertise like $7,500 off this lease. That's just the federal tax credit that they're passing on to you. So if you have your eye on a car that doesn't qualify for the clean vehicle credit, it's worth looking at some lease prices to see if that might be a better deal financially for you. Okay, we made it through federal. Last section here is state incentives, which I will go through. The state of Massachusetts has a rebate program called More EV. That is a direct rebate if you purchase or lease an electric vehicle. It used to just be one program. Now there's lots of sub-programs, so we'll go through each one of them. But the standard one is $3,500 for a battery electric vehicle, so plug-in hybrids do not qualify. The MSRP must be under $55,000. You qualify if you purchase or if you do a 36-month lease. And it doesn't matter where you purchase it. You could purchase from a dealer in Massachusetts or outside of Massachusetts. As long as you are a resident of Massachusetts, you qualify. There are two options for how to get it. You can either get the car and then fill some paperwork out online and get a check sent to you in the mail. Or if you're at a dealership that is registered with the state, you can get it at the point of sale. And there is actually a list of the dealers on a website, so you can look. If you qualify, so if your income meets is under a certain limit, or if you participate in an income qualified program, and there's a whole list of that, then you qualify for a used car rebate. So here it's also $3,500, still just for battery electric vehicles. But the vehicle sales price has to be under $40,000. You do have to purchase at a dealership in Massachusetts, and you have to sign an attestation form that the vehicle hasn't gotten a rebate in the last 3 years. I don't know how they're going to check that, but you do have to do that. You can get this again at a list at one of these participating dealers. You just have to be pre-authorized, which you can do through a form on the More EV website, or you can do it post-purchase by applying online. There's another income-related adder. This one is called More EV Plus. If you participate in one of the programs on the list, then you can qualify for an additional rebate of $1,500. Again, there's a list of those programs on the website. You can add this to More EV Standard or to More EV Used. And again, you can get it at the point of sale as long as you get that pre-qualification authorization on the More EV website. So we'll summarize all this in a minute. The last sub-program to be aware of is called More EV Trucks. If you are looking for a pickup truck, this is the program for you. Here, the MSRP limit is $80,000 and the amount is $7,500, which we'll show you in a moment. But this is also available to more than just residents, businesses, and educational nonprofits. All those can also qualify for More EV Trucks. And if you do happen to run a fleet and have vehicles that are much bigger than that, there's also incentives for those. We're just not going into those in detail today. So next slide, I think, shows us a couple of the examples. The Ford E-Transit, there's one in the parking lot right now. And then some of the pickup trucks, these are the ones that are big enough and heavy enough that they qualify as a truck and get this higher incentive amount. If we go to the next slide, I forgot about this one. There's always one I forget about. There's a new incentive called More EV Trade-In, where if you are trading in a very old gas-powered car, if it's over 12 years old, you qualify for an additional $1,000 that you can add on top of More EV Standard and More EV Plus. There are lots of requirements on what that vehicle that you're trading in looks like, and we've got all the details written out here. I won't run through all of them, but basically it has to be a vehicle that's over 12 years old and that you've actually been using. You can't just go buy a 12-year-old vehicle on Craigslist and then try and turn that in. It has to have been registered in your family for a certain amount of time and all that. But all those details are on the More EV website as well. So this is a little bit of a summary slide of the different incentives. There's an asterisk on the trade-in, not because you can be a non-Mass resident for any of this, but you can't get the trade-in if you are a business or a nonprofit or an educational institution. So that's what that asterisk is. But you can see in the first column sort of what each of those rebates is. Then if you qualify for More EV Plus, what you can add to that. Then if you qualify for More EV Trade-In, what you can add to that. So you can see that you can get a good chunk of money off of a new or used EV. And again, this is in addition to the federal tax credit stuff. So you can take the $7,500 from the federal tax credit, add it to the $6,000 or $3,500, whatever you qualify for. We're almost at the end, I promise. So this is all very confusing, but we have made a shopping tool that hopefully makes this easier for you, where we have a car card for all of the different electric vehicle models that are generally available in New England. And for each one, we'll tell you things like what is the efficiency, how far does it drive, how fast does it charge, what charging port does it have, all that stuff. But we'll also tell you what is the base MSRP, does it qualify for the federal tax credit, does it qualify for the state rebate, and like what is the lowest price after incentives for that model. So you can check off different qualifications that you might be looking for, like I definitely want it to have 200 miles of range or what have you, and then you can sort and filter to figure out what vehicle models make sense for you. And then if we have a relationship with a dealer that sells that vehicle, you can sign up to test drive with a dealership through our tool as well. But it's very useful just to get a sense of the different vehicle models. And I don't think we have a screenshot of this, but you can also look at pre-owned vehicles and learn about the different models that are out there, what they generally cost, and figure out, okay, if my budget is this and I want to use an electric vehicle, what are the models I should be looking for?
And the website is for this?
The website is, oh, that's not there, sorry. It's greenenergyconsumers.org/drivegreen. That'll get you to lots of pages that will explain all the topics we talked about today, but also the shopping tool. And I think there's one more slide that I am contractually obliged to show, which is we're a nonprofit, and we welcome your support. If you are able to support us, we would love that so that we can do more presentations like this and advocate for the kinds of policies that we need to make sure that we have access to charging and these rebates are funded and offshore wind and lots of other things that we do too. But I'll stop there and we can go back to the question slide. But you know, I have to talk about the donate slide, otherwise I'm not doing my job. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was very informative. Thank you. So have you got any questions in the room? Oh, I see where.
At one of your earlier slides, it was about batteries. And it didn't include transportation costs, and I know that the manufacturers and the rebate deciders are hoping that more batteries will be made in the United States. But is the transportation cost in there at all from Asia to us?
You for the total cost, sorry, for the lifetime emissions? I believe that's in there. I believe that's in there. That is a Union of Concerned Scientists study, so I could go double check their methodology, but I think that's included.
Okay, thanks.
What I will say is that the structure of the federal tax credit encourages a more circular economy. So in those complicated battery requirements, some of them are either you are mining or processing these minerals in North America or in a country that we have a free trade agreement with, or they're recycled. So they're trying to really encourage that. And then separately, the Inflation Reduction Act has a huge amount of funding and tax incentives and tax credits to do more battery manufacturing. So there's some cool websites that will show you the number of battery manufacturing and recycling plants that have been announced in the past couple of years, and that space is growing really fast. So
In America?
yeah.
So, okay.
But
Yay.
there's only one place that these batteries are made. for
He's
these
saying there's
vehicles,
only one
and
place where
that's
they're
not
now
in
made.
America.
This is true. So a huge percentage of the mineral processing and battery construction is currently in China, and that is the Inflation Reduction Act is a climate bill, but it's also an industrial, economic bill, and so there are lots of provisions in there to try and shift that, and that is slowly happening. It's actually happening quite fast in terms of how quickly these things can shift, but that will be a big shift that we will see in the coming years.
If you should go up so the people on Zoom can hear you. That's what that microphone.
Tesla makes batteries in Texas
Yeah.
for their
But there is no facility right now in the United States that's making batteries for these vehicles.
I know there's so many that have been announced. I don't know which ones are
Announced.
operational, but they're coming. There might not be
Announced.
right now, but they're coming.
Announced, but there's none being built. There's none open.
They're being built, but they might not be open. That I don't know.
Okay.
General Motors is building one, Ford's building one, Volkswagen is building one because they're building cars now in the United States. They're building battery manufacturing plants in the United States.
But they're not producing any batteries, period.
Tesla is producing batteries for their Model Ys in Austin, Texas. They are indeed.
So they would qualify for the rebates.
They do. They build their 4670 batteries, which is a rather large cell, and they have other places they're manufacturing those too, but I know it's primarily in Austin, Texas.
That's one. But the other question that I have is, what about the electrical grid itself? Okay, we have, right now, so many cars using gasoline. Okay, if everybody goes electric, okay, what happens to the grid itself?
I'm so excited to talk about this because we do a lot of work on this. So should I repeat the question? I don't know if...
Yeah, might as well.
Okay, so the question is, what about the grid? Basically, can the grid handle all these electric vehicles? The short answer is, if we were all to switch to electric vehicles tomorrow, no. But because this is going to be gradual, we can do it. So there are
So we can do anything we choose to. We went to the moon, okay? But the thing is, right now, during the summertime, okay, if everybody using their electric,
Yep.
the air conditioners, okay, they have brownouts, right?
Not for
They do.
quite a while, not in this state, not for quite a while.
If you don't mind, I can explain some of the things that are in place because there's a lot happening at the state level on this front. So there are several different planning processes that are happening right now to address this. So the electric utilities know this load is coming, we have to prepare for it. And so this is a question both of how do we generate the electricity? We're going to have more kilowatt hours that we need to sell, but also how do we distribute the electricity? Can the grid handle it? Do we need to upgrade transmission and distribution infrastructure to make sure that the grid itself isn't congested and we can get the electricity where it needs to go? Right now, there's a giant process at the Department of Public Utilities called a grid modernization process, where the electric utilities have been forced, thanks to the state telling them to sit down and say, okay, from now until 2035 and looking out to 2050, if we're going to electrify all these vehicles and also electrify all this heating and also bring on all this offshore wind and solar, what is that going to look like? Where are the congestion points? And how are we going to build out this infrastructure and pay for it? So there's a whole process right now at the Department of Public Utilities to answer exactly that question. To the sort of second question that you asked about peak demand. So for those who haven't heard that term before, there are there's basically like 40 hours of the year that are disproportionately expensive and polluting. And those are the hours in the summer when it's really, really hot. Everybody's got their AC on, and the demand on the electric grid is ridiculously high compared to the rest of the year. And on those days, we basically have to crank on the old power plants that don't run any other time of the year just to meet the demand on those peak days. And so as we shift transportation and heating to electricity, what we really want to do is avoid exacerbating those peaks. We do not want to charge 10,000 EVs on a peak day and make that peak higher. The really cool thing about EVs in particular is that they are really easy to shift load and soak up excess renewable energy. You're starting to see this in California, where they've got so much solar in the middle of the day that they've got programs where, with price signals or active management, you can shift when your car charges to soak that up. We could do the same thing with offshore wind at night. In the winter, when it's super windy, you can soak up that excess stuff, but it also means that you can discourage people from charging at those super, super peak times. So what we're going to see in the sort of next 10 years are those programs. They're called managed charging programs, and the utilities are actually, they're proposing them right now, where either you'll sign up for some sort of a program where you are incentivized financially to not charge at those peak times. To basically, if you charge, you'll pay more in the peak times, but you'll pay less on the off-peak times. Or they've also had programs where if you're like, I don't even want to think about that, like I don't want to have to remember that, where you can basically say, I give you permission to, on those 7 days in the summer when demand is so high, to ramp down my charging automatically through my charger that I have at home and pay me $20 or $50 for the contribution that I'm making to the grid. So in the short term, that's what we're going to see. What's really exciting in the long term, looking out to like 2040, 2050, is the potential to use all these batteries as generators, basically, to discharge electricity back onto the grid and really actually bring all those peaks down. So there's in Beverly, Massachusetts, they've got some electric school buses that are already doing this. That's like the cutting edge of this, on some of the summer peaks last day, those buses were discharging electricity back into the grid and basically selling electricity back into the grid. So they can, the vision here is have all these vehicles charging up to take in solar energy in the middle of the day when the sun is shining, and then discharge it at 5 or 6 or 7 when everybody's coming home and turning on their microwaves and all that. So I hear a lot about California. They have rolling brownouts. They've got a bigger grid problem than we do for sure. How are they going to do all these EVs? But it's actually like the EVs can help. They can help smooth out that demand, because right now, if you look at like demand goes up and down over a day, you can use the EVs to balance that out a little bit, which means the grid runs more efficiently and will actually serve as a resource on those peak days. So there's a lot that needs to happen to make that 2040, 2050 vision happen, but there's a lot of work happening right now to do the short-term stuff to prepare us really well for that. So I'm glad you asked the question, because I'm really excited about this topic, if you can't tell. But I think it's going to be really cool.
Are there questions online?
Yes. I was just going to add to that answer a little bit, if I may.
Come, use a...
Hi, I'm Sue Thomas. I'm the Town Sustainability Coordinator. And I just wanted to share that on the residential side, if you have a smart thermostat, you can already contribute to that program through your relationship with National Grid. They have a program, and the town is looking at participating in ramping down the schools this summer on those high peak days, and getting money in return for that arrangement. We haven't yet signed that demand response contract, but we're looking at it. So these features are already here. They're not here to the degree that the state envisions it, but they are happening. So I just wanted to share that. And there is a question online. I'll read it. Okay. You may need to repeat it for me because you have the mic, but Joanna Myers asked, you have a slide describing the new agreements between Tesla and all major manufacturers to provide NACS adapters. I did did not spot Toyota on the list on that slide. Does this mean that Toyota RAV4 Prime PHEV will not have the adapter for Tesla chargers?
I think that does not mean that. I think we just didn't update it. Yep. Nope. Sorry. That is Toyota has made this agreement with NACS. For the North American Charging Standard. What I don't know is how fast any of these manufacturers will actually get those adapters out, because the adapters are both like physical hardware, which is I think the less hard part of this, of just like making the wires go the right way, but there's software. The vehicle has to have a handshake, so to speak, with the charger, so that they can communicate, and the vehicle can basically tell the charger, stop charging, the battery is full, or charge at this speed because the battery is empty. And that's the stuff that those manufacturers are going to have to work out a way to talk to each other. So I don't know how quickly it will be, but Toyota is on the list.
I would note, in response to this question, that plug-in hybrids generally are not capable of DC fast charging.
That is a very good point.
You ought to repeat that, Anna. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you for the very important point here, Tom, which is that plug-in hybrids like the Toyota RAV4 Prime generally don't have DC fast charging capabilities. So if you were asking about the Toyota BZ4X, which is their all-electric vehicle, there you'll probably get an adapter. I don't think that the RAV4 is one of the plug-in hybrids that has DC fast charging. So there, it's actually a moot point for you. Thank you for bringing that up.
Any more online? I have, here I am again. I have three things. When we first moved to Westford, we had an electric meter program where if we used our washer and dryer after like 8:30 at night, we receive, it cost us less. And so I'm wondering sort of why the electric company isn't doing that to, you can't answer this, but I'm just saying that it did happen at one point that they were encouraging people to use off-peak hours.
So National Grid does have an off-peak charging rebate for electric vehicles. So if you have either a qualifying vehicle or a qualifying charger, and they've got a list on their website, you can sign up and you can save 5 cents per kilowatt hour if you charge off-peak during the summer months, and 3 cents a kilowatt hour if you charge off-peak during the winter months. We, in our advocacy hats, have been saying for a long time that those incentives are way too small. If you actually do the math to see the actual lesser costs that you are imposing on the system, those incentives should be bigger. I talked about the grid modernization process right now. There's a separate EV time of use rate process at the Department of Public Utilities where we're also making this point. So National Grid actually has a program. If anybody on the line is from Eversource territory, they don't right now. They've been saying for a long time that they're going to propose something, and I look forward to them actually proposing it. But National Grid does have an off-peak charging rebate program, and in general, Massachusetts is pretty behind the rest of the state because we've all got what I just affectionately call dumb meters. We don't have smart meters. In California and other places, they have meters, electric meters, that can communicate to the utility when you're using electricity. And what that enables is a lot more creative rate design where you can incentivize people to charge off peak, charge at night. You can do lots of different things. In Massachusetts, those advanced meters are going to be rolling out between like 2026 and 2027, 2028. And once those are in place, I think we'll see a lot more time of use rates or off-peak charging rebates or all sorts of things that can incentivize us to use electricity at a time where it's cheaper for all of us. We just have to wait for those meters to get installed, and that's going to take a couple years. But until then, we've got this off-peak charging rebate.
If you have solar panels like I do, you've got a smart meter.
Yeah.
It comes with the
But is there anything that citizens can do to encourage the
I'm
adaptation
so glad you
of
asked.
things?
There's a bill.
Good.
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I can find it and share it afterwards. So Representative Owens, who's out of Lexington, and Senator Keenan, who's out of Quincy, both filed a bill that would direct the electric utilities to offer an off-peak charging rebate to electric vehicle drivers in this weird in-between time where we don't have those advanced meters yet. We can do an off-peak charging rebate, either using the vehicle telematics or the smart charging station. And the bill says basically, electric utilities, you have to propose this, but when you propose it, here are the benefits of off-peak charging that you have to calculate a value for. So there are, this is getting real nitty-gritty, but I'll give you a teaser, and if you want to go deeper, we can go deeper. But basically, National Grid, when it calculated that 3 and 5 cents, was only looking at how much does it cost to generate electricity at an off-peak time versus on-peak time. They did not look at how much does it cost to transmit or distribute, or what are the greenhouse gas benefits or the energy efficiency benefits. So there's all these other benefits that they didn't calculate because they didn't want to. And what this bill says is, here's a list of benefits. We're not going to tell you what the numbers are. We know you know the actual numbers better than we do, but at the very least, you need to calculate a value for this and show your math to the Department of Public Utilities, and they can tell us whether that math is appropriate or not. So that bill is out there.
Anna, is it part of the Senator Barrett's omnibus bill, which is?
It is not. Well, so the House, the two chambers are at different points right now. The House has released 5, we're calling them mini buses, where basically they took pieces of lots of different bills and smushed them together. And none of those have the off-peak charging piece in them. The Senate is still holding on to their bills. They haven't released any mini buses yet. And that's expected sometime later in April or maybe even May. So that those bills are still alive, though. They haven't been killed, so it's absolutely still appropriate to reach out to your representative or your senator and say, I support these bills. But then the Senate still has time to actually incorporate it into a minibus. So it could go through a minibus or an omnibus, or it could go separately, but it's still alive regardless.
But the House can't incorporate the smart chargers at this point.
They could.
They heard from enough people?
Yeah, we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see. This gets really complicated really quickly, because last year's climate law that did pass required the utilities to propose time of use rates, which is what's happening now. But there's a really weird legal distinction that a rate requires a revenue grade meter. And so the utilities are both like, we don't have revenue grade meters, so why should we propose a rate that we can't apply until later this decade, which is a fair point. But an off-peak charging rebate they could do anytime they wanted. So this is kind of like, I think that was the intention of last year's climate law, but that legal distinction was not clear, and now it is. So the off-peak charging rebate will hopefully actually get at what that last year's climate law was trying to
So we
get at.
should say, please implement the off-peak rebate.
I will find you the bill numbers. I don't have those memorized,
Okay.
but it's actually called an act relative to off-peak charging or something like that.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I think I signed up with your organization because last summer I would get emails saying shave the peak.
Yes.
And we did that. We basically, I think you said from like 5 to 8 or something, turn your air conditioning or your heat pump temperatures up to X. And, and I think that really was effective. I don't know if you have the numbers, but it was a great email to get.
Yeah, so we have a program called Shave the Peak, which is entirely voluntary, where on those summer days when it's really, really hot, we send out texts or emails to people who are interested to unplug your car, delay your dishwasher, whatever it is to reduce your electricity usage in that time. I don't think we are technological enough to calculate what impact we're having beyond who's opening our emails. But the point of that program is to say, look, people want to do this. People know how to do this, and look how much more we could do this if the utility were running this program and if there were financial incentives. And again, those financial incentives would not just be like a subsidy because we want to do the right thing, but they would actually be a reflection of, it is cheaper for us to pay you to shift your load than it is for us to go out and generate more electricity and distribute it. So it is in everybody's benefit to have programs like that.
Something I think that's important to bring up is, remember when the gas price peaked? Well, electricity stayed the same, so if you have an electric car, it doesn't really matter what gas prices do, because your cost is fixed. Gas prices can spike.
Yeah,
So,
but there's a cycle that it will catch up.
I know, but over time,
Over
my
time.
electricity cost, at least in here, we're living in Westford, for the next 3 years, I know my electric cost per kilowatt hour is fixed.
Can you talk about that, Jerry, the POP program?
Do you have an aggregation program?
We do have an aggregation we call it Westford Power Options Program.
So you're
So there's 3 levels of participation.
So that is I don't know if people are people familiar with that
Some are.
I would take this opportunity to mention it for
Would you like to do
3
that?
minutes.
He'd be better at it than I would. Since,
Well, I can aggregation in
he-
general.
he- yeah,
I'm the coordinator.
Well, then you should make a plug for this.
yeah.
And that pun was intended.
So I didn't care if it went to $6 a gallon.
So electric aggregation, as we call it, a local version, the Power Options Program, or Westford POP, enables residents and businesses to sign up for this program, and the electricity rates are fixed for the period of the contract. The prior contract was for a 3-year period. This contract is actually for a 2-year period, because the expectation is that the rates are going to be a little bit better in 2 years, so we want to take advantage of that. But your cost per kilowatt hour for electric supply is fixed according to the contract, and residents have the option of accepting the standard program, which is the state mandate, plus 10%, and that adds up to be about 65% of the electricity that is delivered is renewable in one of the levels of renewable. The resident can also sign up for a 100% program, which means that 100% of the electric supply is coming from renewables, and a good portion of that is coming from Green Energy Consumer Alliance. And residents can also opt down to the state mandated minimums only, and there are price differences of a few pennies per kilowatt for those three. But it's known, there's no penalties involved in signing on or dropping off of the program, but those prices are fixed according to the contract.
How do people do that, Tom?
On the main page of the Westford town government, there's a bumper there that says electric aggregation. You click on that and it takes you to the site within the westfordma.gov to sign up.
Well, I think at this point we'll wrap it up.
Oh, Saturday.
Yeah, so again, on Saturday morning from 9 to 12 in the parking lot in back of the Abbott School here in Westford, we'll have a neighbor to neighbor electric vehicle sort of car show. If you'd like to learn about electric cars and people and their experiences with their electric vehicles, and there'll be a number of different brands represented, come see us. We'll be here. Not supposed to rain. Thanks very much for...
Free parking.
Yeah, and free parking. Thanks very much for everybody who participated, and thank you very much, Anna, for coming all the way from wherever you came from, way out here to Westford to present to us. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Great job.